Welcome, everyone. I know Wendy Clymer is helping me and will admit people that are still going to be, you know, uh, signing on. My name is Leigh Altadonna. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the current president of the Wyncote Bird Club, Wyncote Audubon Society, and tonight's presentation is about the Bird Club, which I was, when I was much younger, I was a member of their board and have some knowledge of their history. I am going to ask people, we are recorded. I will ask you all to make sure you mute so we don't have any disruption to the recording for this program that we can retain for our records in our YouTube channel for Wyncote Audubon and in our archives. I'll be talking just a moment about a number of the things related to the old Wyncote Bird Club, which again, I knew many of the individuals that you're going to be seeing tonight. So I go back a long ways. I'm probably one of the few people left that knew and worked with some of these people when I was a youngster, and we'll go from there. So with that, I'm going to move forward with this. This is the April meeting. The April regular monthly meeting. It's just totally virtual. As you can see, I am not in Philadelphia or anywhere near Philadelphia. I'm actually in California, if you can see the background here. And that's why we made this program all virtual. I had hoped to do this in person at our usual meeting place, the Upper Dublin Public Library, because this month is our 110th birthday of the Wyncote Bird Club and Wyncote Audubon Society. Collectively, we would be 110 years old as of April 12th. So we were hoping to meet in person, but circumstances required me to be here in California. So we are doing it virtually. You'll just have to get your own piece of birthday cake after the meeting or sometime over the weekend. But with that, let's get started. I've given this program one other time, kind of a version of it to the Old York Road Historical Society. You'll see at the end of the slideshow why the Old York Road Historical Society is important to the institutional history and some of the actual documents and records that we have. And we'll move on forward here. This is a picture that comes from the archives. And as you can see, this is not current. This is from near the beginning of the Wyncote Bird Club. And a lot of their work in that era was related to education. You're going to see a bit why. But you look at the students, you can see the way they are dressed. You can see the way some of the adults are dressed. And I don't know the individuals that are in this picture. I did get a question whether one of the individuals was Florence Griscom, and I can't confirm that. Hopefully, I'll be able to get some information, in the future about some of the other photographs that are here. But let's get started with the beginning. The Wyncote Bird Club was founded in 1914. I don't know if part of my slide is hidden. There we go. So at any rate, a gentleman named Ernest Harold Baines, I believe was from New Hampshire, was traveling up and down much of the Northeast, and he was starting bird clubs. Happened to write a pretty important book, an unusual title, but the foreword was by Theodore Roosevelt. It was a book that, if you get a chance to get it, I know it's been reprinted, and it really does kind of form a guide for what bird clubs should do. Well, he came to Wyncote, literally, to Wyncote, which is a little hamlet in Cheltenham Township, and he spoke to the individuals there. There was not a bird club. Many of his cousins, the Haycocks, lived in Wyncote, and I believe he was probably invited down by them. And he did this presentation about bird clubs, and this is a book that came out in 1915, a year later, and there's a reference to the bird club in his book. But if you read this, he really talks about science. He talks about conservation. There's some unusual things that he talks about that modern conservation doesn't really, I guess, get involved with their support today. But we can, talk further about some of this. This is what he looked like. And this is the quote from his book in 1915. I made it much larger. He talked about bird clubs could meet anywhere, and the fact that the Wyncote Bird Club met in a church that happens to be All Hallows Church, about a block from the Jenkintown Wyncote train station on Greenwood Avenue. And that's where the club first met. But that's where he did this presentation. And it was shortly after this presentation that the folks that were there decided that we're going to form the Wyncote Bird Club. And there are some lists of the charter members that I'm trying to find. And I do know that the Haycocks were a significant number of the charter members of the Wyncote Bird Club. And they then continued to organize. They created a bylaws and elected a president. I believe that was a Mr. Quartz. And, we can go from there. More about Ernest Harold Baines. He was a naturalist. He wrote a lot of books, about natural history. This happens to be a story about a fox that I believe was on his property in New Hampshire. And on the right, he's kissing a chickadee. Obviously, he's probably feeding it a seed. And, pretty interesting photograph. This is also very interesting. This comes out of some of the early discussions and publications in a book called, or a magazine called Bird Lore. Bird Lore is the forerunner of Audubon magazine, and Esther Haycock and others would go up to New York or give reports on what the Bird Club was doing, and they would frequently talk about some of their educational work with children, much like that first photograph that I saw did a few slides earlier. This picture on the left, I believe that is Ernest Harold Baines. One of the ways he suggested that they get kids involved is through theater to learn about birds. And I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of these things, but he would get kids in costume, and our early predecessors in the Bird Club did this as well. And the idea is they would be a script to talk about the importance of birds and protecting them. Here is one. I don't know which of these children. There's three of them here. One obviously in an eagle outfit, and two youngsters that are supposedly farmers. And they're in the Kinglet Bird Club. The Wyncote Bird Club formed a school club at the Wyncote Elementary School, and students would do this play. And one of these, I believe, is Heinz Heinemann, who was interviewed for a study about Junior Audubon and his early experience with the Bird Club by Amy Winesall, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But as part of the play and the discussion, the dialogue had to do with protecting birds. So here is an example of the bird mask and some of the costume and plays that went forward. Ernest Harold Baines came for additional meetings. You can see here that these were about different natural history pieces. I note in the upper left, you'll see the logo of that time. It was a nondescript bird, probably something like a mockingbird, on a kind of a Victorian-looking design in Wyncote Bird Club, and a nest indicated. But these were the kind of cards the early clubs sent out. They were actually postcards. They were hand-addressed, and they would go out to the membership to announce their meetings. Here's a kind of report in Bird Lore, 1916, talks about the the bird club and what they were doing with the children here, talking about erecting birdhouses. But you can find some of these things not just at Wyncote Audubon, but their Wyncote Bird Club, but some of the other bird clubs that were active, many were in the Northeast. There are other references to some of the early members and active leaders of the club or people that helped. And one of which I'll get back to is Ernest Hicks Parry, um, who was in here as well. Here's the larger picture from bird lore and what the youngsters were doing in terms of erecting a birdhouse. Again, yeah, it's fun to see the way students were dressed in that era for school. And I don't know exactly where this location is. Again, maybe as I get to be able to do a bit more research, I'll be able to find out a bit more about the club. This is kind of an interesting a report. This is from 1922, some years later. And it talks again about the activities of the Wyncote Bird Club. And you should be able to read this. Ernest Quartz, I believe, was the first president of the Bird Club. And again, not everybody was from Wyncote, but you can see here that they talked about some of the different kinds of activities that they were doing. I was kind of curious of what the nature study films were in that era. Yeah, I'm not so much aware. I know that films became an important part of some of the bird club meetings back in that era. But then I also see a reference to Liberty Bell Bird Club, which was just another small club. There were a lot of smaller clubs like Wyncote throughout the Philadelphia region and in many parts of the state and in the Northeast. They tend to be community-based. It wasn't just Wyncote, however. I knew a lot of the early members came from Abington and Glenside and portions of Northwest Philadelphia, to name others. But there's a little playlet here called The Blind Shall See from the junior members of the Bird Club that's being reported on. And you saw this picture before. I have a couple of them. This playlet was again designed to have dialogue to talk about why birds were important and why it was important to save them. So they did that through this kind of a playlet or theater. Here's another one. Looks like some birds instructing other birds, and obviously they're instructing the adults and other children that are watching the playlet. Other things the Bird Club did, and again, Esther Haycock was a very early photographer, did a lot of photography, did a lot of time-lapse even, some of the early time-lapse photography and film of wildflowers blooming. She loved doing a lot of these kinds of photographs. I remember seeing some of her programs as a youngster, as an elementary age boy, and bluebirds were a favorite of her as well. A wonderful picture of a bluebird on a cannon with a nest in the cannon in the middle of New Hope, kind of thing that she would do. And here's some of the early films. Here's a letter from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is about a banded bird, but this is one of the early films she had too. Many of these films are still around, I believe, probably a Briarbush. I know a number are in our archives at the Old York Road Historical Society, and probably need some help to get these preserved if they're still good. Back then, most of these films were 16 millimeter, and they're in these kinds of cans. But I know that these films don't last forever. Here's some other of Esther Haycock's pictures. I'm sorry the slide isn't great, but she would make these kind of greeting bookmarks with her photography each year. I have several. I think they're all in our archives now at this point, and you can see, to the extent that it's blurry from my perspective here, that different types of birds that she had photographed. Going on, a contemporary of Esther Haycock was, of course, Florence Griscom and her husband, Everett Griscom. If you've ever been to Briarbush, this is where they lived. And this is really right outside what is now called the Griscom Observatory. If you sit in the Briarbush Griscom Observatory, this feeder had a little copper band around a drilled log that had suet, but the jar was peanut butter. So they filled peanut butter, and it was kind of the left side of the observatory, right off the corner, place where I knew Mrs. Griscom sat to observe the birds each day. This is another picture of them. The picture to the right is more how I remember Mrs. Griscom. I never met or knew Everett Griscom. By the time my sister and I were youngsters, and we would walk from Glenside to visit Briarbush each day, it would be more like the picture on the right. The windows opened up. The feeders were all designed and built by Everett Griscom. Weather vane feeders, if you don't know what they are, they would turn in the wind so that the feeder and the birds would be able to feed in kind of an enclosed three-sided feeder, and they would be on the leeward side and out of the wind when they fed. He had many other kinds of feeders as well. And the next slide kind of shows some of the ways they made some additional revenue. And I found this particularly interesting, in terms of some of the things that they were involved with. I know my sister and I bought our bird seed at Briarbush. They had 50-gallon drums off the back part of the observatory that doesn't exist anymore, but they had a shed that they would sell feeders and bird seed. And the other things about the natural rock bird baths, Mr. Everett Griscom would chisel out rock to make bird baths and then fit them over a branch. He'd have over the bird bath a bucket that would be filled with water and a spigot that he would put in the bottom so that it would be a drip bird bath. Now there's so many modern ways that bird baths are constructed to have the water move, but he created that type of thing. The box traps, I would go back to Ernest Harold Baines, and this was an era when some birds were not considered, or other creatures not considered particularly helpful. Accipiters like that we see at our feeders from time to time, like Cooper's hawk or sharp-shinned hawks, were not particularly welcome. There were other kinds of things that I know Mrs. Griscom did to manage cats that showed up on her property, and most of them were lethal. They were not always, humane, but that was doing some kinds of things that talking about some of the birds that were not particularly welcome to the feeders there. And part of the reason I remember from Mrs. Griscom and others, the European starling was a real villain. And that is because there was a decline in the bluebird population, a lot of concern about let's control the starlings so that the bluebirds don't disappear. And there were a lot of efforts that way to destroy their nests and other kinds of things that they advocated. The other that was very interesting in the minutes that are at the in the archives, and I need to dig deeper, the house sparrow was a major concern as well. Again, another bird that would deprive, from their point of view, did. A lot of the native birds were out competed for nesting boxes that were put up for them. And so the idea, there was one thing I need to double check, but I think there was an effort to try to eradicate the house sparrows that were showing up in Jenkintown, a borough that was next door to Wyncote. And there were even some suggestions that they might form a food source. And again, I need to document that. These things were passing in the minutes. I don't know how serious. I kind of doubt that it would have been a very serious or economically viable way to control house sparrows, but it more of a reflection of how people felt about these introduced species of birds that were coming in. Also on this card, the bird study groups. Really want to point that out. Mrs. Griscom did a great deal of teaching, not just in when she was younger in the log cabin that was actually the home in which they lived. But I have reports and other notes that she would go out to high schools or go out to other schools and teach about birds and conservation. And for those of you that go back a long way and know the portion of Roslyn where the sanctuary Briarbush is located, the trolley tracks used to roll right by along Edge Hill Road there. She also did the bird talks here. I just found this fascinating to see what they were doing. Here's some of the feeders that were in birdhouses that were invented by Mr. Griscom. A lot of copper. And then, this was open. And I don't know, the weather vane feeder was down over here somewhere. I don't think Briarbush has, if you went there now, would maintain or see these kinds of feeders in use any longer. I think they've used a lot more modern ones. Talking about Mrs. Griscom going out, there is now just formed this year an Abington High School bird club with about 50 members. Well, they weren't the first bird club in Abington. They looked in the archives of their yearbook, and they found that in the 1920s, there was a bird club, and I think it became a nature club that was formed at the high school. So this would have been the old high school, probably became Huntington Junior, no longer stands. It's I believe a retirement residence there on Susquehanna Road. But these are the bird clubbers from that era. And again, Florence Griscom had a great deal to do with starting that club. Prominent member of that club was a gentleman named Herbert Mills. Keep that name in mind. In your mind, I'll be talking a bit more about him. But he was a youngster. I don't know if he lived in Glenside. I'm going to be relying on the current bird club to see if they can do a bit more research, whether he lived in Glenside or Abington, or he would not have lived in Wyncote because he was at Abington High School. And I believe he became the leader of the bird club / nature club and was active while he was there. He joined the Wyncote Bird Club at age 7. So that's very interesting. As around the age I started getting involved, but it might be a few years earlier. But he was taken under the wing of sorts from the bird club folks. He ultimately became the vice president of the Wyncote Bird Club. He went on, and I don't know what he did in his life or his family's. In terms of their work or the work of his parents. It'd be interesting to find that out. But he became an avid conservationist. He became chairman of the National Audubon Society Board of Directors. And I'm going to circle back on how that related to another kind of directive from that Ernest Harold Baines book about wild bird guests, about the need to protect and preserve land and create a sanctuary if you're a bird club. So at any rate, he was chairman of the National Audubon Society. I think this would have been in the 50s. Following his stint, I read different things. He became the executive director of the World Wildlife Fund. I believe that was formed in the 60s, and he moved on to become the executive director of what is now a very active worldwide conservation group. And for those of you that get down to Stone Harbor, the Wetlands Institute, if you go in and visit, you'll see a number of things related to, um, his role in creating the Wetlands Institute in Stone Harbor with Lehigh University and other partners, but very important to get that done. And he became a resident of South Jersey, I think Bridgeton, New Jersey, and so this became a focus for him. But going back, he was in that bird club. I don't know if he is in this photo, but he was clearly in the bird club, and that he ended up again at Mrs. Griscom's Reach as an educator, had all this kind of happen with him. Here's the Wetlands Institute. You may pass it on the main causeway going into Stone Harbor. If you stop by there, it's often a good place for shorebird migration this time of year or later. Here's the Glenside Weldon School, another piece of the education of Reach with Mrs. Griscom and others. The principal at this school was the individual who ended up helping to preserve Briarbush as a nature center. Let me get back to that. Principal was named T. Russell Frank. When Mrs. Griscom died in the 60s, he was vice president of the Bird Club at that point, but he became active. He got representatives from the Bird Club, from, I believe, the local Kiwanis Club, of which he was a member, and his PTO. He was a pretty influential administrator in the Abington School District. Glenside Weldon was both an elementary and a junior high. Some people thought he was so powerful, they called this the Glenside Weldon School District, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he had a lot of influence. And it was he who, upon the passing of Florence Griscom, Everett had already passed away, worked to make sure that the property was preserved as a bird sanctuary. There was some chance that Gravania Avenue, which is, if you know the property, it's kind of a paper street at dead ends at Briarbush on either side. And there was some concern that Gravania Avenue would be put through and houses built on either side, similar to the ones that are exist in that vicinity now, but Briarbush was preserved. I think he tried to work with the school district and the township, and ultimately it became an Abington Township facility. But he did a lot with the teachers to teach about environmental education. Another thing he had done, and others had done, not just T. Russell Frank, oh boy, I'm sorry, is that Hog Island became an important part of the National Audubon Society's educational program. Wyncote Bird Club sent people called Griscom Scholars, would pay for their tuition to go to, back in the day, it was a 2-week camp based on different kinds of themes. And latter day now, they're 1-week sessions. Some are for educators, some are for families, some are for birding and other types of environmental activities. But it's up off the coast of Maine, Muscongas Bay, about an hour north of Portland or so. And again, we have been able to continue that legacy to send educators to Education Week, and also sometimes young people now to the youth camps. Now, back in the day, you'll be introducing you to a couple of other people who had passed through the Wyncote Bird Club. You had to be 18 years or older to go to the camp. There was no youth camp. It was an adult camp. But when I talk later about John Kreischer and his cousin was underage, and they were able to get special dispensation to go, even though they were underage. Probably something wouldn't happen in the modern era, but they got to go. As it was really a formative experience to be there. I got to go as a Griscom scholar when I was 17, and I also needed special dispensation to get in. But luckily, Bruce and John were well behaved, and they gave me, I guess based on their good behavior, I was able to go for 2 weeks in high school. Now, here's Edward Hicks Parry. I talked about him a little bit earlier. The idea of preserving land was something that was important to the Bird Club, and again to Ernest Harold Baines, something he professed. And there's a number of places in the minutes where it looks like the Bird Club really worked hard to try to get land preserved. This is right along the Tookenny Creek in Cheltenham, and they were able to get the township to preserve an important, now we would call it an important riparian buffer, as part of the work to protect habitat. Similarly, George Purley, an early member of the Bird Club. This is further upstream from the Parry Sanctuary, but again, part of the Cheltenham Township Park System, and the early bird clubbers had a lot to do with trying to make sure these properties were protected. John Dornan, another name, kind of a formative figure, very skillful photographer. He had this huge 16 mm equipment for films. He would go to Antarctica and bring back stories of, his trips to the Southern Hemisphere and Antarctica. We have several of these films still in our archives. And again, similar to the ones with Esther Haycock, I think we're going to need to really see if they can be preserved and put into a format that saves what they had done. Again, here's the old postcard, and what they did with what they had done with the having people come to the Bird Club. So it's kind of interesting. I'm seeing here that bring your friends, guests are 25 cents. There was a membership fee, and they did check cards, membership cards, and that, and then they have bird walks as well. Here's a little bit about John Dornan. Harry Franzen, if you look at the bottom of the right-hand side of this slide, Harry Franzen was on the Wyncote board, Wyncote Bird Club, and later Wyncote Audubon. And he was the author of this biography or obituary of John Dornan when he passed. But on the left, I bulleted a number of points about him. And I think those of us that were younger and a few slides will remember him. He was a burly man. He had quite a brogue. I think most of us thought he was Scottish, but he was actually South African and moved to Northern Ireland. But he had quite an accent and this very deep voice. And we'd give frequent programs. He would narrate his films. But quite an interesting character. He was a master woodworker, and he did many of our programs. And toward the bottom here, he had quite surprisingly had quite a bit of money that he left in his will. Briarbush, Delaware Valley Ornithological Club were recipients of that, and Wyncote Audubon got one of the larger amounts of his bequest that has now really formed the basis of our start of an endowment fund, which we still maintain. He did the sign. I believe he had constructed and did the sign at Crosswick Sanctuary. We're going to talk a little bit about Crosswicks here as a very special case in connecting it back to Herbert Mills. Again, the Bird Club, Wyncote Bird Club, was not interested in owning property. They were always pleased to see the Cheltenham Township Parks Department take it. And in this case, there were a number of individuals who wanted to donate property, a wet woodland in Crosswicks, in the Meadowbrook section of Abington Township. And it was working with Herbert Mills that they were able to get Audubon to take on the ownership of the property. Herbert Mills wrote about this as kind of a new initiative with bird clubs. Audubon chapters didn't really exist yet, but with bird clubs, the idea is that the National Audubon Society would take on the ownership of parcels like this. It was about 12 acres, and that the management would become the local bird club. He promoted it with the National Audubon Board as a model for future land preservation. I think it's the only model that ever existed, and I think it was the relationship between him and Mr. Parry, who had then become the president of the Bird Club at that point, that allowed this to go forward. And it was a property all the way up until a few years ago, where it is now part of the Abington Parks and Rec because of some additional land that had come in. Here's some of the trails in the sanctuary. I remember as a youngster, probably a teenager at that point, some of the elders of Wyncote Bird Club taking me through, trying to show me property markers, figuring that I would be around to remember where all these um, parcels were. It's where I happen to remember where I saw my first life rusty blackbird. It was there in a creek that runs through, and it was Mr. Frank that brought me through the property during a work day. And they had a number of things there. They had, again, to honor John Dornan, they had his trail. They had a feeding meadow, and they actually was some of the Griscom bird feeders, and would maintain an active feeding station in the middle of the property, similar to almost what we are doing. If you think of, you got the Militia Hill Hawk Watch in Fort Washington State Park. It's kind of similar to what is happening there, where Wyncote maintains the feeders at Fort Washington State Park near the um, Hawk Watch platform. Some early work days. I'm in a couple of these, just I don't know. And I didn't try to look for these. And then I know Wendy Clymer's on the call. Her parents were very active with it. Here's her father. And very important here is this woman, Jean Cedar. She became chair of the our Crosswicks committee on the board of Wyncote Bird Club, and then later Wyncote Audubon. And she wrote the history of the Bird Club's tract of land. And this is her in the middle, Jennifer Sherwood, who is still our primary contact as coordinating things with the township and Crosswick Sanctuary. And the reason it became a township property is because of the woman on the right, Nancy Pozell. She donated property that was kind of in the middle of the sanctuary that she owned when she subdivided her home when she was about to move. There was no access to it, and the gift wouldn't be allowed without access. So the way that that problem got solved is by the township taking title and an MOU with the National Audubon Society that would be a bird sanctuary, not converted to playing fields or other kinds of uses, but in a bird study area. And that was how they were able to keep a pond and some other good habitat that Nancy Pozell provided. And here's Jean getting what we call an award. This is probably the Ed Parry Award. There's a number of us that have been involved with the Bird Club and Audubon, and that we were really pleased to give this to her. And we'll talk a little bit more about the John Dornan and Ed Parry Award as well. But some important people here, except for the guy on the very left. Here's some other folks that got the award, early award of the Ed Parry Award is Dale and Jeanette Twining. Dale was a major birder, a world-class birder with the DVOC. Let me just go back a little bit. And Jeanette was famous with hospitality. Back then, the Bird Club really was a club. Everybody kind of knew each other. Jeanette would bring a lot of baked goods to meetings, the monthly meetings. Dale would lead some of the field trips. And again, he's credited with getting some of our members into the DVOC back in the day, and I won't go into great detail about that, but you needed to have a sponsor, and he sponsored some of our early people into becoming members of the Delaware Valley Ornithological Club. Here's the plaque. Edward Hicks Parry, don't have a whole lot of photos of him, but he was president of the Bird Club for over 30 years. I have some letters that I had seen that Florence Griscom wrote to him. And in all of this, there's a major Quaker influence in the early leaders of the Bird Club. And Edward Hicks Parry was a conscientious objector in World War I. And there's a letter from Florence Griscom to Ed Parry. He was of age, he was drafted, but he worked in a non-combatant locally in Philadelphia, I believe, having to do with, I don't know the name of it, but uniforms and that kind of thing being developed. But it was a way to honor Edward Hicks Parry and people like Dale and Jeanette, who were so important to the chapter, and when it became an Audubon chapter. The other thing Dale did, I'm sorry, this picture's a little blurry, but Dale kept very well-written, handwritten records of the birds he saw from the time he was a teenager, I believe in 1935, all the way up into the around 2012. He kept these journals, and what we had done, his granddaughter and his daughter Wendy, Stephanie Clymer and Wendy Clymer, said, we need to preserve these records and get them into eBird and find a way to get them in the historical section of eBird. So they got involved with a process with Cornell. They got all these volunteers. They were trained, and they transcribed all these bird lists that he had done so that they could be preserved with eBird, and that those books and notes would not be lost, that they would actually have a historic ornithological purpose, and that the data would be around. Oops, this is some of the kids that helped. We got high school students to help to some degree. These are Abington High School students. No bird club at this point. High school librarian and a bunch of the kids would get service learning hours with this. But let me go back here. Some of the things that they had worked with, of course, everything was being done on computer. But we needed old bird guides because the names of the birds changed. They evolve, and the names of the birds that were referenced in Dale's notes were sometimes unrecognizable. People, what was that bird? So they had to go back and look at an old bird guide to find that out, or talk to research that a little bit better so we had accurate information. The other thing that was fascinating as we did this, he would often talk about his first of year birds. And I think on any given day now, if you wanted to see a Canada goose in the Philadelphia area or in the area, of Montgomery County, you can find a Canada goose any day of the year. But back then you didn't. And so it was always interesting to see that, in the 40s, you'd see Dale writing down his first a year bird of a Canada goose in March, returning from the south, flying north with the migration in the spring. So some of the habits of birds have changed. And that's what the data is important for. A couple of other things, going back to Russ Frank and to the Bird Club and its educational purpose. There was something called the National Audubon Film Tour. They had gotten these wonderful nature photographers that would go to Alaska and other kinds of places, and they would come back and do these films. They would often do them as our monthly meeting. So it might be an April monthly meeting, but then T. Russell Frank would make sure it was also done at the auditorium at the Glenside Wellness School for students. So there would be a matinee or somehow linked together, and the Bird Club continued its educational work to do that. We celebrated our 100th anniversary in 2014. The Wyncote Bird Club had by that time become the Wyncote Audubon Society, and this program is primarily really looking at the history of the bird club, but obviously it links. And here's the woman who got the Ed Parry Award, I believe the very first one. Betty Derbyshire was the president of the bird club, and she converted us from being the bird club to an Audubon chapter. And a couple of the patches and logos that evolved later. And what Betty and I think the folks understood is that the bird clubs in that era, by the time we got into the 60s, membership was hard to sustain. I'm going to show you some photos of me and some others. We would joke that when we came to Bird Club as kids, that we brought the average age of the Bird Club membership down from 85 to 82. They were only pretty much retired elderly people in the club, and other bird clubs were facing the same thing in that era. But becoming a chapter all of a sudden infused us with the support of the National Audubon Society, members of the National Audubon Society, revenue that was provided to the early chapters in that era to help us, stay active and become able to sustain our educational programs and our monthly programming and our conservation work. So we became a chapter in 1967, 1968. And I was a college student on the board at that point, and we converted to an Audubon chapter. So here is our certificate signed by the president of Audubon in 2014. And then here is these are two former presidents, Martin Selzer and Jane Henderson. And this is the individual that was president of Audubon, Pennsylvania, executive director of Audubon, Pennsylvania. Phil was our vice president, not of the chapter, but of the Audubon work in Pennsylvania. Two folks that joined us were youngsters along with me in the old Wyncote Bird Club. To the left, the gentleman, I was going to say the gentleman with the beard, they both have beards, but the gentleman with the check shirt is Dr. Joseph Wonderly. Grew up in Glenside, grew up through the Bird Club, had some contact with Briarbush, and became an ornithologist and has done a lot of great research, particularly in the Caribbean. He was one of the first individuals that was able to document the benefits of shade coffee. You hear about that if you get your coffee from the Smithsonian or others. They talk about shade coffee. Well, his research helped to contribute to the importance of shade coffee plantations to help the migrants that breed here in winter in Central and South America. And so he also became the president of Birds Caribbean, helped to organize Birds Caribbean, and is still on their board and very active, with Birds Caribbean, and pretty important organization for the islands in the Caribbean and the conservation challenges that they face. On the right is John Kreischer, again, an Abington High School kid. Grew up through the Bird Club. He was one of the individuals that preceded me at Hog Island Camp. He and his cousin were well behaved. It helped me to get in as underage. I don't think John was underage, but his cousin Bruce Carrick was. And at any rate, John is probably more widely known by the Neotropical Companion. It's almost a must-read if you're ever going to go to the tropics to do birding. But he is an ecologist, went to a temple in Rutgers, and then did a lot of work actually with Herbert Mills toward the end of Herbert Mills's life. And when he was with World Wildlife, John did some work while he was a student at Rutgers in New Jersey. And again, Herbert Mills was based in Bridgeton. Here's one of John's latest books. He also is an instructor at the Hog Island camp. Here he is getting our Parry Award. No, he got the John Dornan Conservation Award. He could have gotten the Parry Award, but most of his work was outside of the chapter. And here's Joe, who did the presentation, the introduction to John at I think at that point it was our annual dinner, not yet our annual luncheon. And here's Joe and his wife Jean. She is a star in her own right. She is a mycologist, has a PhD. Oops, has a PhD, and has done a lot of work again in the Caribbean. They are both retired now from the U.S. Forest Service, and they lived in Puerto Rico for decades, but as their home base. But did a lot of research. But Jean has no direct connection to the Wyncote Bird Club. She's a young woman from Ohio, and here's one of Joe's books on the right. He's one of the authors on the natural history of the Bahamas. And here's Joe to the left and Leigh to the right. Here I am on the right-hand side. We grew up a few blocks apart. We discovered each other when we started going to Bird Club, and we each had these great cameras. And so I took a picture of Joe, and if you can see, I have a Brownie box camera in my right hand on the right-hand side. And Joe had some kind of sleek camera that he took my picture. So, and this is in a field that it's kind of between where we lived. He lived on the other side of the field a few blocks, and I lived on this side of the field. And we did a lot of birding in the area together as youngsters. Now, getting to Scott and Amy Weinsaw. I think most of you know Scott Weinsaw, a very prolific author, well-known. He's the chairman of the board of the Hog Island, Friends of Hog Island. But Amy, I'm going to focus on. Amy talked and did her dissertation. She was a well-known environmental educator, and she did her doctoral work at Antioch University. And if you look at the title of her program, I heard her speak, and she said she became intrigued by the fact that some of these very accomplished people, she would read obituaries, in terms of doing this research for her dissertation, who would put, of all their accomplishments, that would indicate something that they were junior Audubon Club members, that they somehow participated in junior Audubon as youngsters, and that had an influence with them in their life work. Very kind of curious and interesting that was said. And, so she interviewed people like Joe Wenderly, Heinz Heinemann, who I referenced. And this is kind of the abstract, but she really talks about the fact that this work with youngsters and influential people, that have been significant in the kids growing up, students growing up, and taking an interest in their natural history development was particularly critical from the results of her research. And it kind of goes back to those early pictures of the Bird Club in 1916, in 1922, working with students. And I'm really pleased to say that this is still a major thrust for the Wyncote Audubon Society now, that youth education, things like Audubon Adventures is still a major thrust for our work. And, bird walks for kids and other kinds of things. One actually happened this afternoon with the Olney Christian School, one of our old Audubon Adventure schools, which unfortunately with COVID, we lost a lot of that connection. We need to rebuild, but this is an important thing. And then finally, where a lot of information needs to be delved into, and I need to get back to, I'm hoping with more time in the near future, I can get to the Old York Road Historical Society and really dig into the archives that we have there. For years, when I was with the Bird Club and in the early Audubon transition, each officer or each position literally had boxes of materials from their predecessors. And, so the membership chair had a box or two of all the stuff that the membership chair had, not all from 1914, but, year after year, kind of accumulated. The field trip chair, the president, would have all these things. And unfortunately, we were finding out that sometimes these were being thrown out. Some of our history was being tossed out by the next person in the chain, saying, "Hey, I remember one membership chair threw out membership records that included the charter members of the original Bird Club." Not really thinking, "Hey, we don't need these," and that was the decision that individual made. But we thought, no, we need to make sure we get this stuff preserved and saved, and so it now all resides with the Old York Road Historical Society. 18 linear feet of stuff that's accumulated. That includes our minutes. Back in the day, they were detailed minutes of each, not just board meeting, but of each monthly meeting. Very interesting kind of record of things that were done, including what I need to get back to see if there was any kind of serious attempt to propose that English sparrows be a food source. But it's the kind of thing to dig into. So I will say in closing, if any of you have records or old material from the Wyncote Bird Club or even Wyncote Audubon, we welcome it. Get it to us. You can check our website. I'm sure even as Briarbush renovations and its beautiful updating gets done, I'm sure that if you had it there, we could ask them to prevail upon them to take any material you might have, so we could put it into these archives. Because once these records are lost, they're lost. But it's great to have these things on file and available for research. So that concludes the program. I don't know if there are questions. I don't even know how many people are still with us, but I think what I'd like to do is close down my slideshow and go to a gallery, if I can figure out how to do that. And let's see if I can. There we all are. So if any of you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, and I'm very happy to try to answer any questions. So you just had a history lecture. If you stay on for about 5 or 8 more, we could probably give you some course credits.
I don't have a particular question, but I just really, really enjoyed this. And I'd like to actually watch it again in case there's anything that I missed, but it was really wonderful. And I thank you so much, Leigh, for doing this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joan. And what we will be doing is, again, this will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel, and hopefully it'll be part of the archives. Again, I'm one of the few people that knew some of these individuals either personally or knew that they came to Bird Club. I didn't know Herbert Mills personally, other than the fact they came to Bird Club at least once each year and spoke to us.
I guess one thing I got out of this is a regret that I never got involved with birding as young as you did, or at least much younger than I did, because I think I missed a lot and I really would have enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it was hard to find. It's kind of interesting when we did the 100th year anniversary. Um, it wasn't something, and this is kind of interesting to say, is that you didn't go around when you were in high school. When I was of high school age, John Kreischer talked about this too. He graduated from Abington a few years ahead of me. Is that you didn't go around saying, "Hey, I'm a bird watcher," because being nerdy in that era wasn't particularly a popular thing. And then what's so interesting now is here's this new Abington High School Bird Club. 50 kids are in it. It's kind of like being a nerd is cool. So it's kind of the way the world turned. But I know Joe Wendley and I, we were at Glenside Welding Junior High School together. Joe went on to a different high school in another township, but we were there and we were giving the program that was with the Wyncote Bird Club that night, and we were going to give a short piece on the birds of Abington. So here's an all-school auditorium, junior high school, and Russ Frank, the principal, announces, "Oh, Leigh Altadonna and Joe Wonderly are doing the program tonight on the birds of Abington." And we're like, "Oh my goodness, we're gonna get teased to a fare thee well." We didn't, but it was the kind of thing like, don't let people know I'm a bird watcher. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming this evening. And what we will do is I'm going to be ending the program, and then you'll have the PowerPoint if you need it. Not the PowerPoint, but the recording if you'd like to hear it again. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really
Bye.
wonderful.
Thanks,
Thank-
Liz. Great.
Bye-bye.
That was
Bye.
great. Thank you.
And great to see Paul Majati was on. He's living in Colorado and a former
Paul.
president. Yep.
Hi.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks.
Yeah.
One question.
Doing.
You
still
doing well,
there?
Paul? You're doing good out there?
Yeah, as well as I can.
All right. Well, you have to look us up when you come back east. You'll have to come to a Wyncote Audubon meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Hey, it was fun. Thank you.
All right. Good. All right. Good night.